Speaker.
I call Jenny Solis.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, for this call on the Residential Tenancy Amendment Bill second reading. Mr Speaker, minimum insulation standards and smoke alarms for private rental houses are a step in the right direction. However, this national government can and should do more. This bill proposes a minimum insulation standard, but Mr Speaker, when you insulate a cold house and you do not require modern, efficient heating in that house, that rental property will still leave our people, our families and our children living in a house that is cold and at high risk of respiratory diseases. The rental houses won't magically become warm, dry, safe, healthy homes, Mr Speaker, without installation of modern, efficient heating. This national government does not stand up for the rights of ordinary New Zealanders. If this government cared enough and wanted to do enough for our children on behalf of the hundreds of thousands of families and particularly vulnerable children who rent, who live in both state houses and rental accommodation, Mr Speaker, we would see evidence of that care, we would see evidence of that commitment in this Residential Tenancy Amendments Bill. We do not. This proposed bill makes some improvement for tenants living in rented accommodation, but it is not a comprehensive bill, and it does not go far enough to address the issues for our families. Mr Speaker, Emily Taborn, a name that we hear in this House a lot, a toddler from Otara, Manukau East in my electorate, is an example of a toddler, an innocent child who unfortunately passed away, paid with her life because of the conditions of the house, a state house that she lived in that was freezing cold, mouldy, leaking and unhealthy. The house that she lived in was not fit for a family, for humans to live in. Mr Speaker, I find it heartbreaking when I look back at this child. The information that we've gotten back from the government told us, Mr Speaker, that this particular family reached out many times, over 40 times, to WINZ and to Housing New Zealand, basically saying this child is sick, has been in and out of hospital with so many respiratory illnesses. But the other heartbreaking thing, Mr Speaker, is if the processes of this government worked, that family should have been moved out because her brother, who was 6 years old at the time, had rheumatic fever. Now, WINZ tells us that when kids have rheumatic fever as a condition, they would be moved to a healthy home. This family wasn't, and this child, Emily Taborn, paid with it with her life. It is something that should not have happened. But you know, Mr Speaker, it is something that is still happening. I give you another example, this time from a homeless family, a family that didn't even live in my electorate because they were homeless. This child was a toddler too, about 12 months old, had lived so much of her life, more than half her life in hospital, in and out of hospital, with all sorts of respiratory illnesses, bronchiolitis, pneumonia, you name it. This child, I'm happy to report, is now living in a home. I visited this family last week, and you know, Mr Speaker, it was the first time that I actually saw the mother of this child, because I actually dealt with the father when they came into my office. The mother, this time, Mr Speaker, she was so emotional. She was so emotional because this child was discharged from hospital, from Middlemore in my electorate, in March of this year, and this is the longest period of time that this child has spent outside of the hospital. Why? Because the rental accommodation that this child had lived in before wasn't their own. They were homeless, living in someone else's rental accommodation, but it was cold, mouldy and unhealthy. And people in that house, they smoked. So all of these conditions put together, Mr. Speaker, was a reason why this child was in and out of hospital. So when I hear members of the opposite side say that it is too costly, that it is too expensive to do something to address this issue properly, Mr. Speaker, we are talking about children's lives. Children's lives. Mr. Speaker, I would like to turn now to two submissions to the House Select Committee. I am not a member of this committee, but in just reading the submissions, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to talk about two, both from physicians. There were lots of submissions from doctors, but I'd like to highlight two. The first is from the Children's Commissioner, Dr. Russell Wills, someone that I hold in high regard. Now, Dr. Wills stated that, and I quote, "In budget of 2013, the government committed to mitigating the negative health outcomes of poverty and poor housing." Nice words, Mr. Speaker. It would be nice if this government in this bill actually addressed that promise. This is a bill that is full of broken promises. In budget in May of 2013, 3 years ago, this promise was made. Have we seen that promise come to reality, Mr. Speaker? No. And in fact, Dr. Wills goes even further. He says this bill is a shameful bill. It is shameful because it has not kept up to that promise. It is shameful because it has not ensured that we would even, as my colleague Phil Twyford spoke about before, that we would ensure that the insulation is to today's standards, 2016. We're talking about insulating homes to the standard of 1978. Shameful, Mr. Speaker, that we think it is too costly to try and save children's lives. Dr. Wills tells us that at least 15 children's lives are lost because they have pneumonia, bronchiolitis, and other respiratory diseases, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we should do something in this House to ensure that we save children's lives. The second submission from another physician that I'd like to turn to, she talks about how she is going around a children's ward that is full mainly of poor children, Māori children, and Pacific preschool children, Mr. Speaker. The mother of the first child that this physician sees is someone that is familiar to her. Why? Because she had served this mother, but with the older child the year before. That child, the older child, had pneumonia. The child that she is seeing today, on this date, also had pneumonia. Next child, similar set of circumstances, Mr. Speaker. She sees yet another mother that she is familiar with, because the child that she is in hospital with has permanent lung scarring from too many infections, from too much pneumonia, from being admitted in and out of hospitals too many times. But she saw this mother and served her the year before with her older child. Mr. Speaker, this is a bill that should be delivering on a promise to our children. What this legislation does, like many legislations that we discuss in this House, is it sends a message, Mr. Speaker. And in this case, it sends a message to our children. And in the words of this physician, she states, and I quote, "The message is to our children that they are not important enough for us to set a standard for heating the houses and to make sure that the houses are indeed healthy." Mr. Speaker, our children deserve more. We need to do more as members of Parliament in this House that our children live in warm, dry houses. The bill that Andrew Little has submitted and has passed first reading, Mr. Speaker, it will deliver this. It is a much more comprehensive bill that would ensure that our houses are warm, dry and healthy, and that we are saving children's lives. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
John O'Neill.